instantly staking a claim in the center, opening diagonals for queen and bishop development. Opens the door for the queen and bishop, subtly preparing for pawn advances in the center. Securing central space and preparing to challenge black's pawn structure. Disrupting white's center, this bishop maneuver immediately forces a reaction, often leading to pawn structure concessions. Forcing a decision, white strategically centralizes the bishop, aiming to exploit the pin on the c6 pawn and prepare development. Developing the queen to support the bishop and prepare for castling seems premature given the center still needs to be secured. Unlocking the kingside for future castling while preparing a fianchetto, this subtly reshapes white's pawn structure. Developing a knight to its natural square, this repositions the bishop's earlier pin and prepares for castling, creating a solid defensive structure. Developing the bishop to its intended outpost, this secures the queenside and prepares for castling, anticipating black's central development. Securing the king's safety now allows concentration on developing pieces and challenging white's central pawn structure. Bolstering the center's pawn structure while preparing kingside castling adds a vital piece to white's developing army. Stepping the knight to e4 boldly challenges white's central pawn structure and opens lines for potential piece play. Securing the king's refuge while preparing development truly anchors white's position. Exchanging the bishop here relinquishes the pin and allows white to solidify the center with nc3, potentially creating a cramped position for black. Knight maneuvering towards central dominance, creating immediate pressure on e6. Fortifying the pawn chain and preparing to challenge the center, aiming for a more robust pawn structure. Asserting queenside space, this advance subtly pins down black's bishop and prepares pawn advancement. Retreating the bishop after its initial sortie signals a tactical surrender of the initiative, allowing white to solidify their central control and potentially launch a kingside attack. Pioneering further into black's territory, this pawn advance relentlessly squeezes the bishop and fights for central space. Retreating the bishop from the central skirmish opens up the diagonal for potential queenside pressure. Developing the knight to its most central and active square immediately aims to exert pressure on black's queenside pawn structure and prepares to join the central fight. Boldly challenging the center, this pawn thrust opens diagonals for black's pieces, creating immediate counterplay and disrupting white's compact pawn structure. Focus shifts to developing the queenside and contesting central space, eyeing potential tactical opportunities. Embracing the center with this pawn thrust boldly challenges white's queenside expansion and opens crucial diagonal lines. Preparing to expand on the kingside, this move subtly reinforces the central pawn structure and opens lines for future piece activity. Releasing central tension now opens lines for black's pieces to become active. Opening the e-file now grants white increased central influence and greater piece activity. Black liberates the queen's bishop and initiates a central pawn exchange, embracing the resulting open lines. Recapturing with the knight opens lines for your pieces and eyes the weak pawn on c4. The queen boldly enters the fray, seeking counterplay and challenging white's centralized pieces. Unleashing the d-pawn opens a dynamic central diagonal for your queen and applies pressure to black's slightly loose pawn structure. Unleashing the bishop to f5 challenges white's central pawn chain and opens diagonals for black's queenside pieces. Unpinning the knight opens lines for attack and frees the bishop from its defensive duty. Targeting the weakened kingside, black's queen now eyes the f4 square, aiming to disrupt white's central control and potentially open lines for attack. Frees up the f3 square for potential king's side maneuvering, a subtle positional shift. Challenging the bishop's square now creates immediate tension for the kingside, threatening to disrupt white's pawn structure and king's safety. Securing the d-file intensifies central pressure and prepares for potential pawn advances. The bishop retreats, preserving its influence on the queenside while bracing for white's central pawn push. Sacrificing the bishop unlocks the e-file and initiates a decisive kingside assault, leaving black's monarch exposed. Sacrificing the queen here, black aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and seize initiative, creating dynamic counterplay despite the material deficit. A daring maneuver, seizing central space and threatening to unravel black's queenside. Unleashing the d-pawn opens a diagonal and challenges white's center control, creating dynamic possibilities. Unleashing the rook along the open file seizes a crucial diagonal, threatening the black king's safety. Unleashing the knight to d6 offers a dynamic pawn sacrifice for active piece play, challenging white's central grip. Reinforcing the central pawn and preparing to pressure the queen's flank. Preventing the pawn on g3 from being attacked, this move shores up the kingside's defensive perimeter. This bold advance aims to squeeze black's pieces and restrict their development, creating a lasting spatial advantage. Stepping back from the dangerous g-file, black aims to untangle his pieces and find sanctuary for the vulnerable king. Sharpening the attack on the weakened kingside, this queen maneuver creates immediate threats and complicates black's defense. Exchanging queens here surrenders the initiative and eases white's pressure on the central files. Opening the f-file for attack, this knight now pressures black's queenside. Repositioning the bishop seeks to disrupt white's centralized knights and potentially exploit weaknesses on the queenside. Pawn advances like this are designed to dislodge black's active pieces and gain more breathing room on the queenside. A daring knight repositioning, aiming to disrupt the white pawn chain and potentially seize the open c-file. Seizing the open file immediately punishes black's misplaced knight and forces a simplification that benefits white. Recapturing here solidifies black's pawn structure, creating a more active bishop on the long diagonal. The rook now masters the open file, creating significant pressure on black's structure. Recapturing the rook finally frees the d-file, but opens up a potential endgame where black's isolated queen's rook pawn might become a target. Seizing the open file after the exchange, white aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and exploit the newly created imbalances. Reclaiming the open central files becomes paramount now that the heavy pieces are off the board. Suddenly, the black king is exposed to a dangerous discovered attack across the board. Safeguarding the king is paramount as open files will soon expose him to further threats. Unleashing the knight to eye that exposed kingside pawn, aiming to disrupt black's coordination. Re-establishing active rook presence on the open file is a sound idea. Unleashing a pawn fork, white aggressively targets the a5 knight, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and gain material. Reclaiming the pawn is a natural reaction, but it concedes central space and allows white's knight to become active. Unblocking the knight opens lines for kingside attack, aiming to exploit the weakened black pawn structure. Unleashing a desperate check, hoping to disrupt the impending pawn promotion and gain some counterplay before the inevitable endgame material disadvantage. Securing the king becomes paramount as this endgame transitions, prioritizing safety over immediate material gains. Sensing a potential mating net, black sacrifices a pawn for initiative and seeks activity on the kingside. This knight's repositioning secures the advanced pawn and prepares for increased central pressure, forcing a re-evaluation of black's defense. A calculated retreat to a more secure square, seeking to regroup the king before the rook's inevitable advance. Fortifying the knight with immediate support prepares for an offensive push on the kingside, aiming to exploit the compromised pawn structure. The monarch's exposed position now dictates a cautious retreat, prioritizing safety above all else. Securing king safety, this pawn advance prepares for potential pawn pushes and restricts black's knight. Unleashing the f-pawn generates a crucial pawn chain, aiming to dislodge the aggressive knight and create counterplay. Initiating a king walk is crucial here to join the defensive fray. The rook now becomes an active piece on the second rank, threatening the pawn and potentially creating infiltration opportunities. Shifting the knight to f1 allows for its redeployment, potentially to the active e3 square. The king steps out of the shadows, seeking new pastures to evade the looming knight's influence. Reinforcing the knight's presence on the queen side allows for eventual pawn advances and potential pressure. Injecting dynamism by attacking the central pawn structure aims to disrupt white's cramped queenside and open tactical possibilities. Pawns advance, seeking to restrict black's king and create a passed threat. The rook's return to the first rank signals a desperate bid to disrupt white's encroaching pawn majority, creating a defensive pawn wall to stifle black's advancing king, even at the cost of creating isolated weaknesses. Opening up the king's diagonal allows for a mating attack. The king's newfound openness on the king side presents immediate tactical possibilities for both sides. A desperate check, but it only hastens the unavoidable exposure of the black king to the predatory knight. Reactivating the king's hunting instincts, this bold advance seeks to exploit the exposed enemy monarch. Consolidating the king's safety seems paramount now, seeking respite from the open lines. Activating the knight to a central outpost forces black's pawn structure to become permanently compromised. Seeking respite on the first rank, the rook aims to escape the pawn onslaught and participate in the defensive struggle. Disrupting that solid defensive structure opens pathways for your rook to exploit the weakened kingside. Seeking to exploit the open files for queenside infiltration, though the king remains a bit exposed. Pawns advance, aiming to seal off the black king's escape routes on the queenside. Challenging the monarch's safety with a forcing check, black seeks to disrupt white's coordinated pieces. The king's exposure creates a tactical minefield, demanding meticulous calculation to avoid disaster. Snatching that pawn further exposes your monarch to white's approaching knight and bishop. Snatching the pawn opens a diagonal for your rook to hunt the king. Shifting pieces to the queenside to defend that pawn is a prudent, albeit passive, response to the immediate pressure. Forcing the black king into a more exposed position, aiming to clear a path for the pawn's advancement. Focusing the black king's retreat to the corner allows white's passed pawn to advance with tempo, creating a decisive invasion threat. Striking at the king's escape squares, this knight advance seeks to exploit the exposed monarch. Relocating the rook to h3 offers a slight reprieve, but the king remains exposed and vulnerable to the persistent pawn advances. Creating a mating net with the advancing pawn, forcing the black king into exposed territory. Sacrificing the rook here is a desperate attempt to complicate matters, but it ultimately fails to alter the inevitable mate. The king's exposed position now dictates the pace, as white embraces the unavoidable confrontation. The king, now exposed on g7, faces imminent checks from the approaching white knight. Promoting the queen fundamentally alters the material balance, a decisive shift in this endgame. The endgame is now a matter of forcing the pawn promotion. The king's journey to the center secures the promotion of the pawn,